Yeah, why don't you?
All right, I'm Jennifer Berg from Wake Forest University, and we just got done with a session. I was the moderator. It was a session on narrative forms, and we had a very animated discussion afterwards. We had three very good presenters, one of whom is at the table here, and they talked about what narrative is or has become in the new world of digital media. So Deloy and I sat next to each other in the session, and what were your impressions, Deloy?
I'm Deloy Cole from Greenville College, and yeah, the interesting thing to me was actually Brad's presentation.
Good answer.
Right? Talking about how taking lots of different kinds of media and text from the internet and making it into a narrative. It's very interesting, and how he was talking about how to pull that all together to make a story and to save it. Brad?
So what was it, though, that surprised you about this session? So that was obviously one of the interesting points, but surprises as well?
What sometimes surprises me is that people can speak so abstractly and have their own thoughts, and they know what they're saying, and to me sometimes their thoughts are going like this, like they're not necessarily meeting, yet they seem to think they're communicating with each other, and I sometimes wonder what they think they're saying to each other, because the thoughts are wandering around so much about what is narrative, what can narrative be, what's the influence of franchises on narrative as storytelling gets more extended. It doesn't have an end because there's a Star Wars franchise. There's this whole universe of Star Wars and how that goes on through the culture, and the narrative gets extended. But they're talking about these things, from so many different directions, and it's so abstract. And sometimes I want to just take them and shake them and say, "Tell me in a sentence or two what you mean. What is your main point? Nail it down." And I think at the end here, you do have like three main points. But you left it very open-ended because you said there are these things that constitute narrative, but I don't know how to make it into a narrative yet. I'm not saying there's the stream, there's the Twitter, there's the data, there's the fact that you can search it. There are these components that I think now constitute, and it sounds like what you're saying, Brad, was that we thought we were saying what was different about narrative when it's digital media, when it's online. We thought, but we really weren't, because what we were saying, really, we could have said about this narrative that you write on a piece of paper. But I'm trying to identify what really is different about it, but I still don't know quite how to say what is a particular narrative when I take those components and put them together. Is that true? Is that what you were saying?
No, and that's sort of... It's so early on in this that it's difficult to say, and it would be disingenuous to say, I got this figured out, right? Like, here's what it is. All I can do is suggest, here are the actions that are happening that could only happen based on Metcalfe's law, like Moore's law, like some of the papers that we know drive the way these networks work. And if we start there, what the network is supposed to do, then we can maybe begin to identify what those elements are. And I think so far, and I don't mean this in the braggadocious way that I sound, but so far nobody's disputed those three aspects: the data, the information, and the presentations. So I feel like those seem to be components of it. I don't suggest that that's all of them, or that all of those together work in the same way every time. That, I think, is what we're too early, at least for me. After 2 years, I've just narrowed it down to those three things. And what Mike or somebody asked, like, how does it work in fiction? And that's the answer. I mean, that's the question, right? If it doesn't work in fiction and poetry and theater, then we don't really have narrative form. Because narrative is irrespective of that, right? It's irrespective of the form. We have a narrative element in it. We recognize it in nonfiction and fiction, poetry, lyrics. Yeah, so we have to, and I'm not an expert in any of those areas, which means I have to go sit and listen to lots of people and work with lots of people that do those things to figure out, have I made something up, or are we identifying something that we see? So
what's the difference between data and information?
Context. If you talk to a computer scientist, the difference between data, which is why George Carlin, the date he died, heart attack, that's data. But if I just say heart attack to you, it doesn't mean anything. If I add information and context to that and say George Carlin died on the 22nd of heart failure at 5:55, you now have context for all those data points. And within that sentence, I've actually told you a story too. There's a beginning, middle, and end to that. There's an action that happens, which doesn't suggest that all information is a story, but in that sentence, there was a story.
What do you think Michael Niederman was saying?
the franchise? Which one? Who was?
Franchise, yeah.
Well, the way I took that and was the thing that I pulled and said, well, this is what I think matches what I'm saying, is this pervasive environment, right? I mean, the franchise, whether it be transmedia or however it happens, is that this environment that these stories are being developed in are always extending and always growing, and oftentimes out of control of the original creator. And if we look at the way the data stream happens on the internet, we can sort of have an analogous relationship to that and go, well, maybe we can draw some comparisons and make some metaphorical analysis that will help us understand what's happening online by saying, well, how does fan fiction, I mean, that's the Jenkins work, right? How does fan fiction work and fan culture and remix culture begin to work with franchise and transmedia stuff that we can template onto the web? And what was Emily, was that? Elise,
Yeah.
which was, she was alluding to that a little bit, which is maybe narrative form isn't in a digital environment. Again, this is what I took and said, this is what I think helps me formulate, is that we can't think about it as just this linear on a page. I mean, her presentation, her paper is really about this immersive environment within it, and we have the picture, and we can actually experience the picture in different ways and pull narratives from it. So that, to me, is the common thread, is that we understand there is a pervasiveness to this. What that means, what that suggests about narrative, I don't think any of us know. So now what we have to do, if we're going to teach it, is begin to parse out what that means. And then how can we create from it? I think. Does that seem reasonable?
Yep.
Then I was paying attention. Yeah.